Michael Nelson. He's a professor in computer science department at ODU. Prior to joining ODU, he worked for 11 years with NASA Langley Research Center. He's co-editor of, I'm not going to read all of these acronyms, OAI, PMH, so I assume some professional journals, and his research interests include repository object interaction and alternative approaches to digital preservation, and you can find more about him at his webpage at the Computer Science Department or on Twitter. So let's welcome our speaker.
Thank you. As Dimitri said, thanks for having me to start with. Dimitri said, I'm Michael Nelson, I'm in the Computer Science Department. What I'm going to present today is joint work. Yasmin is the PhD student that does all the real work, obviously. And then Michelle Weigel is my colleague, also in the CS department. And what I'm here to talk to you today is about combining storytelling and web archives. Michelle spoke last year, about a year ago, and about a lot of the activities that are ongoing in the Web Science and Digital Library group. And she mentioned briefly about storytelling. And since then, we've had IMLS grant funded, and things have really ramped up, and so there's a lot more to report about the business of storytelling. So, for the IMLS grant, there are really two aspects to this. The first thing is we are using stories to summarize or provide collection understanding of what exists in web archives. So we're going to look at a service called Archive.it in which people build collections, and it's a really great service. We do a lot of collaboration with these people, but it's really difficult if you're not the person that built that collection. It's really hard to convey the essence of what that collection contains. So in essence, what we're doing is collections are big, and we're going to generate stories that are small that summarize the collections. The other aspect of this grant is how do these collections get generated? And the thing is generating collections is actually quite difficult. So we want to leverage social media, especially things like stories, which are in services like Storify are curated social media, and use those to generate seed URIs, or URLs, that's what you call them, but URIs, for generating a collection prior to an event, or right on the cusp of an event before it occurs. So in essence, that's the idea of taking something that's small and using that to generate something that's big. All right, so I'm having problems with the clicker. So we'll get to stories in just a second. What I want to talk to you about right now is web archives, right? So I don't need to convince you that the web is important for our cultural history. Any kinds of discussion that we have now takes place primarily on the web. TV shows are available on the web. Radio, video, everything that we interact with has at least a web component as its primary, often its primary component. How do we preserve the web? Now the idea is any discussion about the 21st century will have to talk about the web, and web archives are going to be a necessary component for historians and scholars to discuss the web. So here is an example of CNN.com, all right, a popular news service, and here are screenshots that exist of that page from 2002, 2005, 2009, 2011, of some important events, right? So, here's something about Michael Jackson's death. More importantly, Harold Ramis dying. That's more of a loss to society than Michael Jackson. But this page exists in the internet. Is anyone familiar or used with the Internet Archive? Anyone? Aside from people in my group? Right. All right, so the Internet Archive, you can go to archive.org, and it's a group in California, a nonprofit organization, and they archive the web. They don't grab everything, but they try to, and they do a really exceptional job. So if you want to see how CNN looked 10, 15 years ago, you can go to archive.org and explore and get an idea of what was popular, what was happening, at least as it existed on this page at a given time, right? And we call these snapshots of archived pages, we call them mementos. And this comes from the Memento project, a joint project that we have with Los Alamos. And we go to the web archives and we can access these snapshots of how pages existed, how they existed at various times. So I mentioned the Internet Archive. That was the first. They started in 1996. It's the biggest, it's the most important, it's most complete. They just crawl the web trying to grab everything that they can, right? There are a lot of other services that have different collection development policies. So there are some things called, well, for one example, there's a service called archive.is, right? Based in Iceland, that's the .is domain. So you can go there and give it, anyone can, give it a single URL and it will archive just that page. It won't crawl the whole site, but if there's a page that you want to make sure is archived, you can submit it to archive.is and they'll crawl it. The Internet Archive may have crawled it already, but if you want to make sure it's crawled, you can submit it to these on-demand services. There are a lot of national libraries, national archives, especially in places like Europe, that crawl their top-level domain. So the UK National Archive crawls things in the .uk domain, the French National Library crawls things in the .fr domain, etc. Europe is actually far ahead in the web archiving community. They actually have laws that mandate that they collect things at their top-level domain. And some of the libraries are more open, I mean, some of the web archives are more open than others, but they're crawling tremendous amounts of stuff. But where this is crawling everything it can find, and this is crawling what you submit, here they're just trying to crawl things that exist within their country, right? And then the last thing that we have, or the last kind of service that we have, is Archive-It. Archive-It is a subscription-based service. It's actually run by these people at the Internet Archive. But you get a subscription and you can build your own collections. And a lot of people use this for different purposes. So one is state governments are mandated to archive their own pages, right? And they don't know how to do it, so they get a subscription to Archive-It. They set up a crawl and it archives all of the waterworks pages or something like that. And so the state government pages for the last 10, 15 years are archived using this service. Another thing that is used is if an event occurs, and a fast-breaking event, so something blows up or there's a storm or some big news event, different organizations, often libraries, but different organizations who have a subscription will create a collection based on the event. So one of the things that we looked at was the Boston Marathon bombing, right? Nobody saw that coming. It wasn't a hurricane that you could plan for or something. People recognize this as an important historical event. And the story is fast evolving, right? As we gained more information and we figured out who the suspects were and then we tried to catch them and so forth. And they're archiving the news related to that event. So that's another way that archiving is used. The third way is creating collections that are sort of broadly themed, right? So not based on like a state government website, not based on a news event that spikes, but another way that they generate collections is based on a broad theme like human rights, right? There are certain groups that are interested in human rights and they have a set of pages and they crawl those trying to capture material related to this event, to this theme. All right. So this is what the front page of Archive-It looks like. It's got a pretty page. It advertises. These are 3 separate collections. You can click on those and explore. They have, and I think this has actually changed, they have, what, 5,000 or some collections, something like that now. Hundreds of institutions and over 10 billion archived pages. So they have a lot of material, and these people are creating collections all the time. If we click on one of the collections, this is the kind of page that we would see. So this is the 2013 Boston Marathon. I realize it's kind of hard to see. So we have some metadata that says when this collection was created, a short description giving you a hint of what the material is. We have search boxes, we have some categorical information, social media, news coverage, that kind of stuff. And then we have pages of what we call seed URIs. These are the URLs that people started to collect. And they decided these were important, they had the news or coverage of this event, and these are the things that we should periodically crawl to capture the essence of this historical event. Right. So with the Boston Marathon bombing, you kind of have an idea of what to expect there. So what's the problem with these collections? Right. So it's good that we have them, but the problem is, one of the problems is, there are multiple collections, there's a possibility of multiple collections about different themes. So Yasmin is Egyptian, and a lot of the examples that she pulled, generates from, are based on the Egyptian Revolution or the Arab Spring in general. So if you wanted to learn more about this event, now 3 or 4 years old now, you'll go to archive it and you'll find there are actually multiple collections that cover some aspect of this event. Now, you didn't create these collections. In which collection should you go to learn more about this event? This is actually one of the difficult aspects. So for all the nice services that Archive It provides, what they don't have is anything that facilitates collection summarization or collection understanding. You go to those 3 collections and they all kind of look right. Maybe you do need to pull from all of them, but it's hard to parse exactly which collection covers which aspects. So here's a human rights collection. This is generated by the Columbia University Libraries. This is one of about 7 human rights collections in Archive It. So we have the title, we have a short description, and then we just have page after page of seed URIs. How do I distinguish this collection from all the other collections, right? So I can scroll down and I see some of the metadata about the seed URIs, see the URL, the title, how often it's been captured, the time frames it's been captured, and this is good, it helps, right? But I click on this, and now my interface looks like this, right? So essentially for this top level URL, it's telling me it was captured 2 times in 2011, 4 times in 2012, 3 times 2013, etc. This doesn't really facilitate understanding the essence of this collection, right? Now, if you created this or you're very familiar with acda.co, maybe that's all you need. But I'm betting most of the people here don't have a good idea of what you can expect to find at the other end, right? So our early attempts to support collection summarization, collection understanding, had a flavor where we tried to summarize everything that's in the collection. So we generated timelines, right? And this is coverage of individual seed URIs from, and this is 2008 to 2011 or something like that. And basically, some pages are being added, some pages stop being crawled, but the volume of the collection sort of overwhelms. You can get general patterns, but it's hard to really understand what's happening. There are other services called tree maps. And this is cool, and this gives you an idea where the size of the box indicates the magnitude of a particular category. And I can hover and get an image, and then I click on it, and I can see other portions of this collection. But it's not as good as we would have hoped. And the idea here is we're trying to summarize everything that's in the collection. And that's actually going to be difficult. When we start talking about thousands, potentially thousands of seed URIs, and over time, perhaps hundreds, if not thousands of mementos or copies of those URIs, quickly we're getting into hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pages in our collection. Then we add the dimension of time. Some of these pages stay the same, some of them change at a rapid rate. How do I convey to you one human rights collection to another, or one Egyptian revolution collection from another? So the result is conventional visualization methods don't really work in this aspect. We explored a whole bunch of others aside from the tree map and the timeline and so forth, and they're detailed at that URL. But basically we ran into a dead end, and they did not work well for what we were trying to do. Then we backed up and thought, what about this notion of storytelling, right? we think this is going to really hold a key for us. Now, what do we mean by storytelling? Well, if anyone's from the English department, it's going to mean something slightly different, right? We have the protagonist, and they go on a journey, and they undergo some change, and there's a resolution, right? That's not exactly what. We're not creating characters. We're not telling jokes or anything. I mean, that would be cool, right? I would love to do that. But that's the next project, right? So we don't really mean it in a conventional literature sense, as cool as that would be, right? What we really mean, stories in context of social media, mean something slightly scaled down. So in this case, we have a couple of examples that will work back. Some of these might be familiar to you. So there are a lot of services that are focusing on aspects of storytelling, specifically for social media. Anyone use or familiar with Pinterest? Have friends that use Pinterest, right? Okay, I was going. Anyone willing to admit they use Pinterest? Right? Yeah. Okay. You have some of your friends use Pinterest, right? There's some things like Scoop It that are sort of like personalized newspapers. One of the services that we're really going to focus on is Storify. But we'll talk about Storify, but realize that we sort of mean a lot of these different things, even though they all have different aspects. All right. All right. Having problems with clicking here. One of the unifying aspects of these storytelling services is we have some large number of things, where n is quite large. We want to sample some small number k that represents that n. There are a lot of things that do this. So now this is Yasmin's Facebook page, right? So she's got stories about the Egyptian Revolution. She's got stories about her small child and so forth. Lots of activity on her Facebook page, right? Then Facebook had this thing called Look Back. Right? Anyone use this? Anyone willing to admit they use this? Right? Everyone's being bashful about their social media. So basically, this comes and generates a 1-minute video of all of your Facebook activities, not all of a sampling of your Facebook activities for however long you've been online, right? Now, obviously, it's not going to play everything because we've got too many. Well, she's got too many baby pictures. I've got too many cat pictures, right? You can't play them all, but we'll come up with, I don't know, choosing the ones that people liked the most or had the most engagement with commentary or something like that. Twitter has a capability for creating stories based on tweets and themed tweets and so forth. Anyone use this interface? So I'm just talking into a vacuum for social media here. All right, yeah, okay, a couple of people. Anyone used 1 second every day? This is sort of outside of the Twitter, Facebook aspect. This is a really cool service where if you take video and people shoot on their phone video, basically it forces it and it won't let you cheat. It takes 1 second of a video that you get to choose for every day. And so if you've been on vacation for 2 weeks, you'll get a 14-second video that summarizes what you were doing every day. Now, the thing is, you probably have 30, 45 minutes of video from your vacation, but we can distill it down into something very small, right? And that's the essence. We don't try to include everything. We just try to get a little taste of everything to convey the essence of what you did at a particular time. All right? So what I'm trying to convince you of is that storytelling is something, as our collections of social media are growing, there are a lot of things that are coming about that are sampling from the social media. There's a handful of things here. One is these are popular services that people know how to use, right? Only a few people are admitting it, but I don't know, ask your kids or something like that. They know how to interact with this. All right. As cool as storytelling services are, there's a handful of limitations. All right. Here is a story on Storify that someone has created about a portion of the Egyptian Revolution. So this is about Mubarak resigning. And we have some tweets and some news stories, etc. when I go to click on one of the news stories, the New Zealand Herald has, and that page has now disappeared. It's 404. So essentially, storytelling services are actually acting as bookmarking services, not really archiving services, right? They're recording a link to that page, but not actually the content itself. So it's sort of useful in the immediate term, but from a scholarly or historic point of view, we can't really depend on these resources being there over the long time. So they can disappear, they can go off topic. This is something that another student of mine, Handy Salah-Dean, studied about. He specifically studied social media about the Egyptian Revolution and the resources they linked to, and things disappeared at about the rate of 11% in the first year and about 7% per year after that. So people are tweeting, they're posting pictures, they're making commentary about history as it unfolds, but that material is not being made available to historians because it actually has a very high decay rate. All right, so what are we going to do? All right, so storytelling is good, but it has some limitations. How are we going to combine it with archives? Well, the idea here is the web is what we refer to as very, very big. So the people at Archive It, the subscribers, are creating various collections. And collections you can think of as sampling from the web. You choose a seed URI and decide this is important, that's not important. These are the things that I want to build a collection around. So a collection is a little sample of the web. But this little sample gets quite large over time, and the story becomes a little sample from the collection itself. Right? So we're going from big to small as we go left to right. So the idea here is we can take the Storify services, the storytelling services, people already know how to interact with, right? They're popular services, they frequently use them, as opposed to things like tree maps, which I'm betting none of you have ever actually used, right? So we can't really rely on the semantic understanding of how to interact with a tree map. So we take these services, we sample from the collection, and we can hopefully give you a better idea of what to expect when you go to these various Egyptian revolution stories or these various human rights stories. We can look at the story, get an idea of the nature and characteristics of the story of that collection topic. So the focus here, the research question, is can we automatically identify candidates that pull from the collection that show up into the story? How do we choose K from a much larger N? All right. So archived collections have two dimensions. So we have the URIs that we're saving, and then we have the time frame in which they're captured. Right? So we can index things essentially by a URI and a time. This leads to, in these two dimensions, we're going to get 4 different kinds of stories. The first one is we have a single page and we have a single point in time. You might think, how many different perspectives can you get by visiting the same page at the same time? Well, it turns out it's not just a single page, it's a single page as it's viewed on a particular device, right? So in this case, we have a story as it shows up in a mobile browser and a story as it shows up in a desktop browser. Now, in this particular story, it's sort of the same content reformatted, but oftentimes, especially for top-level pages, there are editorial decisions that are applied for what shows up above the fold and what does not, right? It's not always just the same content that is reformulated. More useful is to use the same page and show how it changes through time, right? So as a new story is unfolding, we go and we take snapshots of that story, and more things blow up or more things burn down or something like that, and the story unfolds. So here's an example for, can't tell which page this is. I don't know, it doesn't matter. It's the same page. I can't read the URL for it. But we're changing through time. And this is you can clearly see this is documenting the resignation of Mubarak as we go through, and he says he won't seek re-election, and then there's protests, and then tanks move in, and then more protests, and eventually he resigns down here, right? So we have the same page, and we're capturing these mementos, and the story is unfolding for us. So we could go the other direction where we fix the time, and then we sample from different seed pages, right? So the idea here is we want to contrast how at roughly the same time the story is being reported in different services, right? So CNN has a perspective, BBC has a perspective, the state newspaper of Egypt has a perspective, and so we have at roughly the same time, the day of the resignation, how this is being covered in all of the major news outlets, right? So that's a different perspective we provide. Another one is we're willing to vary in both dimensions, right? So willing to sample from different pages, and we're willing to cover a broader period of time. So in this case, we're sampling different pages, and we're showing the progression of the story, and we have a broader notion of what's happening in this collection. Right? And so, sampling from these collections, this is an example of some handcrafted stories as they show up in the Storify interface. Right? We get these nice little summaries, and the title, and the descriptions. And the idea is, if we can cleverly sample these, then we'll have an idea of what's in the stories. Now, there's other interfaces possible. Here's a timeline view of the same content, but it's not that we're specifically championing Storify. We're just trying to interact with different interfaces of choosing K. All right. So where is Yasmin in her research? The first thing we're doing is establishing a baseline. And for establishing archive collections, that was done earlier. One of the things I'm going to talk about in a bit is what are the characteristics of good stories. Then the other aspect is analyzing the collection itself. Because especially for long-running collections, we want to identify pages that have gone off topic. So pages are chosen in a collection because they are about something, right? And given enough time, pages, if they go 404, that's easy to identify. If they become about cheap Rolexes, that's harder to identify. So, I mean, humans are good at identifying bad pages, but when determining when it's gone off topic, it's actually harder. This is especially hard because to generate a good story, we'd actually like to not have the same page over and over again. We'd actually like to increase the novelty. So it's not just that Mubarak resigns, but it's the next guy that comes in, and then he's resigned. So a lot of the names and a lot of the places are changing over time. And if we analyze this, we're going to see that actually few of the terms actually line up. But we need to, so the guy after Mubarak was Sisi? Morsi, right? So we go from Mubarak to Morsi. So we need to figure out that that's still on topic, even though the terms don't line up. But when we go from Mubarak to Rolexes, we need to decide, okay, very high novelty, so novel in fact that it's gone off topic, and we need to come back, right? So there's actually this sweet spot of finding something that's not just Mubarak, but Mubarak and Morsi, but exclude the Rolexes. All right, and then the next thing we need to do is start generating and then evaluating the stories. Now, how do we evaluate a good story, right? If we have literally 1 million mementos to choose from, and we're going to choose, say, 20 mementos, there's, I don't know how many combinations, a gazillion combinations, right? How do we know if we've done a good job? And it's kind of like a Turing test. Our approach here for deciding if we've done a good job is we're going to have manually generated stories, and they're going to have automatically generated stories. Now, presumably, the manually generated stories are about people who are qualified to render, make good selections about it, right? So Yasmin can make a good selection about the Egyptian Revolution collection. So we'll take the manually generated stories and the automatically generated stories, and then we'll submit them to human evaluation. Anyone use Mechanical Turk? Is that for not people in my group? Right. Anyone using Mechanical Turk right now to earn 10 cents while I talk? So Mechanical Turk is a service where you go online and do what they call a human intelligence task, and it's often evaluating if things are relevant or good, or if there's a cat in that picture and not that picture, that kind of thing. So the idea is if humans can't tell the difference between a manually good generated story and an automatic generated story, they somehow still capture the essence of what's in the collection, then we're going to call that a success, right? If you can't tell the difference between manual and automatic, then we're going to be done. Okay. So that was covering going from big to small, right? Taking a collection, sampling a few things out, and creating a story. What about using stories to seed the web archiving collections? Now, what I hope I've convinced you of is that generating collections is actually really, really hard, right? But it's something that humans tend to want to do, right? You create reading lists. I mean, creating a course is really like creating a collection. These are the things we're going to talk about. These are the papers we're going to read. These are inbounds. That's out of bounds. It's something that we do, but you have to really know the topic to do that. Now, it requires awareness and domain knowledge. So, as an American, I'm always surprised to find there are other parts of the world, right? And so, you might be surprised as well to find that news occurs in other parts of the world, right? You don't get that from reading American, U.S. media, but things happen in other parts of the world. But if you're not knowledgeable about these other parts of the world, how do you know that something interesting is happening, right? So you actually have to have some knowledge. And surprisingly, they don't speak English in all parts of the world. So if you want to capture it in their native language, then you actually have to have a foreign language. And if you can speak more than one language, clearly you're not American, right? So, so you know, you have to have the knowledge, you have to have awareness, right? Because what if it happens while you're sleeping, right? And if you're sleeping, you're obviously not in graduate school. So, so we can crowdsource, right? We can sort of say, hey, who knows about a good, you know, something's happening here, who's going to inform us? But you, even before you know to ask for help from other people, you have to have some awareness that something interesting is happening. So, on that idea, returning back to Archive It, here's an example, or a screenshot, of the collections that were about the Ukraine prior to early 2014. So we look, and there's some sites created by people at Georgetown University, and they were created around 2008. So it's, you know, blogs about Ukraine and some other sites, etc. Then, in February 2014, they created a collection about the conflict in the Ukraine, right? Something finally, you know, it rose to a certain level where we, you know, it showed up on CNN, and we're like, hey, that probably is important. We should do something about it, right? But, you know, so we have a collection about what's happening in Ukraine. The idea is, it didn't just blow up one day, right? I mean, that's how we sort of get it in our media. But before it reached that point, there was a lot going on. Now, this is not about the Ukraine, because this example was about Nelson Mandela when he died. But this is an example of crowdsourcing the collection of your seed URIs. So if you read this tweet, it talks about, you know, rest in peace, etc. And then has a link to a Google Doc where they're asking for people to submit seed URIs. If you know about Nelson Mandela, nominate something that we should add to the collection, right? And this is an entirely reasonable way to do it, but you know, you're depending on people following Twitter and you know, speaking English and etc. Right? So, what about social media, curated social media, right? Rather than asking people to do it, can we go and read what people are writing and figure out what we should be collecting? So, prior to the Ukraine collection in Archive It in February 2014, when things really got hot, if we check on Storify, we see that people were tweeting and collecting tweets and news stories about what was going on in the Ukraine prior to this flashpoint, right? So in here, this is actually in late January before things have really blown up, but we're having riots, right? So we have pictures of things burning, we have people, we scroll down and we have this text describing this. We have other collections. So, you know, here's pictures of riots, here's pictures, tweets of European ministers talking about it. So people are talking about this thing that's eventually going to become a major story in the US media. The idea here is if we continuously sample from these, can we build collections in advance of something blowing up? Because by the time it shows up in our media, then we've already lost, presumably, all of the lead up, or at least it's hard to discover all the URLs that support the lead up to the story. All right. So, of the stories we've looked at, they have pictures and tweets, and then we have commentary and narratives and so forth. Intuitively, you look at these stories and you think, that's a good story, right? So the next thing is, how can we analyze what makes for a good story, and how can we emulate that? So these results come from a paper that Yasmin presented in Poland just a couple of months ago. All right, so the idea is using these stories, going to a Storify interface, using this as an example, right? But really, hopefully we're learning something more general. Let's pick apart what happens in the Storify interface. So we have things like titles for the entire story. We have text elements, and then we have elements from the web, and then we have news stories, and that's a tweet, and this is just an image, and have interface to help the user create the collection. So the idea here is we want to eventually automatically generate these stories. But to automatically generate a story, we need to have a target as to what our story should look like, right? We need to know when to stop. So the question here is, can we examine the structural characteristics of popular stories and use that as an emulation for what our automatically generated stories look like? All right. So again, structural characteristics. Now, I mean, if you create a story about a popular topic, it'll probably get more views, right? If we're generating stories that summarize collections, the topic is already chosen for us, right? And maybe there's just a limit to how interesting the Department of Waterworks web pages are going to be, right? But if we summarize that collection, it is what it is. But the structural characteristics, that's something that we can control, right? And so in this case, how long are the stories, right? Because humans generate them, we probably have some repeatable patterns for what we can expect for how long the story is. So in this example about the Boston Marathon bombing, there are 31 web elements that the person has created, are sequenced in the story. In this story about, I think this is about the Egyptian Revolution again, this has 19 quotes, essentially these text elements. It has 8 images, 4 videos, right? So a lot of multimedia included in this story. From what domains are people collecting these story materials from? In this case, obviously a lot of stuff comes from Twitter. Storify is a good interface to arrange and curate a set of tweets. A lot of stuff comes from Instagram, right? So people are posting photos and we want to do the same thing. And a little bit comes from Facebook. What are the most used of the domains that show up in the Storify stories, how popular are they on the rest of the web? Now, what you would expect is, obviously, Twitter shows up a lot, and Twitter is a globally popular domain. But there are some domains that are going to show up in Storify that are popular within the interface, but not necessarily popular in the general web itself. Another thing is, how long does the editing of the story go on, right? So if I'm doing something about the Boston Marathon bombing, am I just creating it at one time, or am I coming back and adding new materials, and extending the editing amount of time that the actual story is covering? And in this case, we have a 4-hour window, right? Because in this 4 hours, we learned a great deal. I mean, it wasn't a complete thing. The capture came much later and so forth. And that would, what was that, weeks, days, at least weeks. At least days, if not weeks. And our intuition here is if people are returning and continuing to edit the story, then that is indicative of some level of investment, right? Because it's incorporating new material as it unfolds. All right, and then we want to measure, remember, the New Zealand Herald doesn't have this. How often can we expect to find 404s? Kind of, this is the flip side of the previous slide, where if we're looking for indications of how well the story is cared for, people are probably going to edit these out if they're continuing to curate this collection. Otherwise, it will just die, right? And of the things that are missing, can we in fact use web archives to get mementos or copies of the things that are missing, right? So, one thing I want to tell you, the key for all of our research is always be popular, right? And that's a good life lesson. If you have an option, be popular. You will you'll get more money, and things will just be easier. And so we've done a lot of research, and we're confident that being popular is better than the alternative. And it holds for web pages as well, right? So this story, this was, I guess, a few months ago. This was, right, it's about tragedy, but it's popular because it has almost 20,000 views. The story about Yasmin's pictures of her child and everything only has 64 views, right? So we can't control the content, but we're going to look at stories that are popular and then try to emulate those, right? So we need to get some data. We'll go over this quickly. We use Storify has a really nice API, throw some keywords at it, downloaded a bunch of stories, cut off the ones that we only want to look at the ones that have been online for at least 12 months, right? So we have some idea of what's in there. We're going to throw out the ones that have 0 or 1 views, right? If you create a story and nobody listened, did it happen, right? Tree falling in the forest kind of thing. So essentially, after we cull everything down, we have 14,000 stories created by about 10,000 unique people, and in these stories, we have about 1.2 million elements from the web and also the annotations themselves. So we break these down into popularity percentiles, and so we can see things. The popular stories, well, the most popular stories in the 90th percentile have almost 2,000 views on average. You're going to have 200 elements, web elements, 19 text elements, and they'll have subscribers to the stories. People that are following the story, and when something gets added to the story, they get notified. The maximum is, I can't remember what the story was, but 11 million views, 2,000 elements. That's clearly an outlier, right? A story with 2,000, that's sort of War and Peace of Storify, right? So probably, we don't necessarily want to emulate that, but we want to understand what's happening in this top range, right? So if we look at this, one of the things we're going to see is almost half of the stories have no text elements at all. So even though the interface allows you to provide annotations of the resources that you're collecting, most of the time people aren't doing that. All right. What's the average time span for editing this story? And then we break this down into these intervals, and what we find is there's almost a linear relationship between the amount of time for the editing of the content and the number of views. So the longer you continue to invest in the story, then the more views it's going to generate. There's a slight bump right here where we have more views, but mostly it's a linear relationship. Now the biggest one that we have, with the longest time span, is actually a relatively small story with 33 web elements, but it's been going on for 14 years and it's clearly on a popular topic. All right, what kind of elements do we have? So most of them are links, right? And then we have maybe 20% images, text, video, right? But this links aspect, we actually have to tease that apart to really sort of understand that. It's going to turn out a lot of those links are going to be from the Twitter domain. And we're basically linking to tweets just so we can get the content that's actually in the tweets. All right, so what are the most used domains? So after we process everything, canonicalize, de-shorten everything, we get to almost 26,000 different unique domains. We sort them, and we see some 82% of what people are linking to comes from Twitter. Storify is primarily used for social media, Twitter. All right, here's Google+. Any Google employees in here? So that means no one's using Google+, right? Ask somebody, that's a funny joke, you should have laughed. All right. So in this column, we're looking at the Alexa global rank. So this is a little bit of a cheat. Google+, not that popular, but it's really just ranking google.com, and obviously that's important too. It's much more popular than Google+. But if we back up to Twitter, Twitter's popular here, and it's popular on the regular web. We know that. Some of the other things that are popular within Storify are not popular on the global web. Their global rank is 149,000, 160,000. So they're popular within the storytelling context, but not globally popular. So it's not just, a lot of the stuff comes from Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, etc., but not all of it. All right. I mentioned that we link to tweets so we can get to the stuff that's inside the tweet. So we tease that apart. Here's somebody clearly trying to get, essentially contributing the image, but that doesn't count as an image in the previous slide. So we downsampled within Twitter, and basically what we find is almost half the material that people are linking to in Twitter is really to get to the images themselves. 46%, 4% from Instagram, and then self-linking within Storify is 0.5%. All right. Correlation between popularity in Storify and popularity in, popularity with the Alexa rank and popularity with views in Storify. So what we find is a pretty good correlation for a middling level of resources, and then sort of, as your story gets longer, you start pulling in less popular content, and the views and the live web popularity aren't as correlated. This is different than how people use Pinterest, for example, because in this case you're actually making copies of images, and often that's not going to come from less popular sites. All right, what about the 404 rates? So downsampling this down, we're going to look at basically 250,000 things. Basically what we find is something that matches our previous aspect of missing resources. This is going back in time, and these are the stories that are generated. The red line is the material that's missing. In 2014, we have fewer resources, but we have nearly a linear, fewer things missing. We have a nearly linear rate of disappearance as we go back in time. So that matched what we found in Hanny's work in 2012. All right. Of the things that are missing, can we find them in the web archive? The short answer on this is basically going to be no. Social media is not well archived. If you have a CNN page that's linked, or BBC or something like that, we can find it. Your YouTube video, your tweet, your Facebook page, almost never going to be archived. Right? So what differentiates a popular story? Right? So focusing on the top 25% most popular stories, that's only 3,600 of the 14,000 stories that we have. So speeding this up, skipping over it, basically what we find is popular stories are slightly longer on average than the unpopular stories, having 28 versus 21 elements. And this is a result of them being curated or edited over a longer period of time. Right? So the idea here is this gives us an idea of how big K should be when we're sampling from N. Right? We should shoot for about 28 to emulate what's a popular story. The other aspect is we have a lower decay rate in popular stories, presumably as a function of the editing attention that it receives. So people are curating this collection, and probably either linking to more stable resources or removing the resources that go offline. So popular stories have a 10% decay rate. Unpopular stories have about 15% decay rate. The distribution of the elements, so popular stories, basically takeaway here is we're going to have more images where possible in popular stories. All right, so in conclusion for this, we looked at what constitutes popular stories, 14,000 stories, 1.2 million elements. We looked at, we have min, median, max values for popular and unpopular stories. And basically we have targets to shoot for values of K, and where possible we have some guidance on which domains and types of media to select from when generating the stories. All right, that's all the slides that I had, and I'll be happy to take any questions that you have.
Thank you. Questions? This is an interesting topic. Go ahead.
This seems like something that you're making fun of Google, but like a company like Google would be very interested. Do you know if they have any, or Facebook, or do they have interests in this area? Or?
Well, so Facebook has an interest in keeping you at Facebook and providing, so that, I mean, they have services like Look Back, and they also have, there's the other service when they, if you have a post or an image or something and it was like 3 years ago today or something like that, that's indicative of them looking back through your personal archive and trying to surface things from the past and sort of make them interesting into the future. Facebook has almost no interest in telling you about resources that are on Facebook, right? So that's kind of the issue, right? That all these platforms are in competition and they want to keep you at their content. The same way with the Twitter aspect, right? Basically, they're arranging tweets, right? And
Okay,
they're
but
sort
what
of
about
saying,
like a company like Google, where?
so there are things like Google Trends and sort of an interface into visualizing things like news, but mostly they have no backward, or they have little desire for backwards looking things, right? They're continually trying to give you the most up-to-date resource. So if you type something in about some event, especially some event that's ongoing, it's going to give you the most up-to-date information. It's not going to have a backwards, learn about, how we got to this point in time, right? I'm at a loss for a current web story, but I don't know. If during the Boston Marathon bombing, right, you want to know what's going on. You don't necessarily want to, from their perspective, don't want to unroll the story back to its source. That's something that historians, scholars, and so forth want to do. And so far, Google hasn't expressed any interest in, from my perspective, any interest in that.
Go ahead.
Do you think there's a need to implement something for like privacy or protect people that might not want to?
So this is actually, so the question is, what were the privacy implications? All right, so this is actually a really difficult issue, and in true fashion, I'm not really going to give you an answer, right? So on one hand, you'll say, well, these are all public things, right? You posted it to Twitter. I mean, Facebook will sort of ignore that, but Twitter, clearly it's a public resource. But you have implications, especially when you're looking at revolutions in countries, right? People post things. A lot of these accounts are then closed down, or they delete the content. People might have, decide they don't want to be associated with what they publicly said. To the extent that these things are archived, or you're at least surfacing them, you're essentially outing them, and it's not just a question perhaps of embarrassment or something, right? If the regime is changed, right, that might have real world implications for being for or against something at some prior point in time. I certainly have no real guidance to offer on that. I mean, it's an issue. There are lots of people that are holding on to this material, right? So there are services like Topsy, we haven't even talked about that, which is basically a social media search engine. They have copies of all your stuff, whether you've deleted it or not, right? So, I mean, now it's easy for me to say, well, you shouldn't have spread it if you didn't want it to be public, but, you know, there are real world implications for this. And I don't really have any real guidance. We're not going to halt our work because of this, but we are aware, especially when, so a lot of our examples tend to be about, you know, disasters, you know, the hurricane or storm, or there's no shortage of revolutions, right? So they make for good examples, and then you think, well, we really are sort of surfacing some of this content, right?
So I have a question. So this is mostly based on heuristics, right? You're trying to evaluate what's popular, what's in the news. But what if there's somebody in the background, right, that keeps making things popular, right? So like the Department of Rewriting History in 1984. So how can you tell that?
Well, I'm not sure it's something that we can tell because it's all self-reported from the services itself.
So is there some math? Can you put this in a mathematical background, in framework? I'm sorry.
Well, see, so
a more formal thing than based on popularity.
Well, so the short answer is probably no.
Okay.
We are treating, so in this case, Storify, we're treating their API as a black box. So if they tell us this story had 100 views and this one had 5 views, there's no way that we can verify that, right? We are implicitly counting on, they're actually pretty good at detecting when things are being gamed, right? So we're depending on them to report to us in good faith things like popularity, right? Now, the heuristic is, so assuming that they're reporting good information, our heuristic is, in deciding what to emulate, we want to emulate the things that are popular. We want to emulate the structural characteristics of things that are popular and not the unpopular stories. As I mentioned, the collections are what they're about. So, you know, there's no way that the waterworks department is going to be interesting. We can't, you know, we can summarize it, but it's going to be a really boring story, right? But, you know, the collections, somebody's already decided what the collection is about. All we can do is work within that. And within that, we can decide, well, if it comes down to, this page has images and this one doesn't, what we've learned is, well, obviously, images make for a good visual story, so we need to check the resource or include the resource that has, even if they're textually similar, then prefer the one that has images.
Right. And then my follow-up question would be, so you depend on whatever is in the archive, right? So you
That's
start
correct.
from the archive. So that's pretty much depending on a set of samples.
Yes.
So if those samples will no longer be there, then so what? Who's ensuring the
well, I mean, that's the
accuracy
function
the
of,
archives?
well, that's the function of the archive, right?
Okay.
I mean, that's the essence of an archive.
Okay.
Now, it's possible. So the Internet Archive is based in San Francisco, right? So if they have an earthquake slide off into the ocean, they have copies. They actually have copies in Alexandria, in Egypt, and Iceland, and actually here at Old Dominion, we actually have a dark archive of the archival content. So there are other copies, backups that are available, but the essence of an archive is for them to hold on to the information. And to the extent that they're a subscription-based service, right, people are essentially buying some measure of promise of future curation of their content.
Any other questions?
So, just looking at the statistical numbers that you gathered, it didn't seem to be, stark difference between popular and unpopular.
No, we're actually expecting to find more significant difference. All right, so the difference, all right, let me be careful not. The differences that we did find were statistically significant. That's not the same as sort of being, I would have much preferred to have gotten up here and told you, well, the unpopular stories have 3 things and the popular ones have 52, and you would go, wow. But yeah, they're sort of anticlimactic. I said 28 versus 21. but that gives us a target to shoot for. I was hoping for something a little more stark, but to the extent that both the popular and unpopular things they're all generated by humans, there's probably just a narrow band in which the humans and interacting with the tool, there's the point in which they get tired or quit or whatever. Popular books and unpopular books are still roughly the same number of words or number of pages, right? So there's probably these external forces that sort of make it a narrow band. But it does inform us. So when we go to, keep an eye, especially to a more formal thing, when we go and say, we think this is a good story, then the next thing is, well, how did you define good? And we at least have this baseline to say, we looked at what humans generated, and these are stories that had existed long enough to either acquire views or not, right? So if a story was published yesterday, maybe it'll be popular in the future, but these were stories that had been around long enough, so they were either going to be popular or not. Now, some of that is based on the content, but given that there's lots of stories about popular things, we want to emulate the structural characteristics of the good ones. And I was hoping for a better distinction, or a more interesting distinction, but we do have a goal to shoot for.
So can we overlay that with link back information somehow, like things that were not that worth, but they were shared on Twitter or Facebook or some other places, and that's how they generated more traffic to that, basically. Me and Yasmin posted the trip reports almost back to back, and mine was posted a couple of days after hers, but then I got more views than hers in next 24 hours or something, because I posted it on Facebook and Twitter and some other places. Not that I have a lot of network, but then still it influenced, actually. And it doesn't really mean that my post was more interesting than hers, but then because of these link back, I got more popularity on that.
So, some of it is a story could be popular because who created it is already popular, right? But again, we're sort of viewing it as a competitive marketplace between stories, and some of them are going to gather traffic and some of them aren't. And if somebody popular, or an organization, it's not necessarily a person, right? Like the Associated Press uses Storify and these news services, right? But people know to read their collections, and so their stories are popular. I don't know. So what we don't do is say, well, this person tweeted this story. Essentially look for traffic in other services.
Right.
All we're looking for is the traffic of the story itself, as reported by the interface.
Yeah.
Since you're using social media, how credible the resulting story will be?
I'm sorry.
Since you're using the social media, if you generate this story, how credible will it be, especially for political?
Oh, right. So we're just beginning on that aspect, essentially taking the story and generating a collection. So one thing that we're aware of is that each one of these stories has a particular point of view, right? You're either for or against, something like that. There are some known techniques to discover, based on the things that you link to, what your point of view is. And then it becomes an editorial decision about how well-rounded to make your points of view on the story, right? So if I want to give a Democratic perspective on some sense as opposed to a Republican perspective on some sense, then I sample within this known bias. If I want to sort of report on the event completely, then I will have to endeavor to have sort of a left-wing and right-wing and left-wing perspective on the story. But there are, based on what you link to, and this is a case where you can actually look at who creates the story, link their Storify identity, we'll say the Twitter identity, figure out who they're following and interacting with. And actually you can, at least within Western stuff, we understand that well enough that we can identify, oh, this guy's a left-wing person, this guy's a right-wing person. And then it's sort of up to you to decide, do I want 3 of one and 1 of this? I mean, not everything should be a 50-50 split, right? Because that's sort of a false equivalence. But if you decide I want 8 of these and 2 of these, then you can go out and get them. But yeah, especially since people are creating these stories, not necessarily with eye to, you know, like with Wikipedia's neutral point of view, right? Where you say, people won't do that in Storify, right? And that's actually something that we're trying to leverage, right? Yeah, we're trying to discover. I mean, we could just go to CNN and copy whatever they have, but we're trying to get this additional material and different perspectives, especially for breaking news, right? You really want this material that might not persist.
Okay, thank you. Let's thank our speaker. I don't want to